Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this panel discussion on breaking with the past. Can mineral production build shared prosperity in the energy transition? I'm Chloe Ferrand. I'm a journalist and the editor of Clean Energy Frontier, which is a series on clean energy technology supply chains, which is published by Climate Home News. I'm delighted to be moderating today's discussion, which is part of London Climate Action Week and is hosted by the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre and Climate Home News, which is a news website covering international climate politics and the energy transition. We have an hour and a half today for this discussion and a fantastic lineup of speakers. We're really lucky to have with us today, and hopefully, we can try and start getting our teeth into this pressing question and offer different perspective and avenues for how do we get to this aspirational goal, or to this goal, to this vision of shared prosperity in the energy transition. So a quick reminder for you in the room, as you can see, we're live on YouTube and LinkedIn, hence all the mics. So thanks for bearing with us as we just adjusted some sounds. But I just wanted to have a really quick reminder of why we're here today and why we actually organise this event as part of London Climate Action Week. I think it's kind of a good place to start to say that the age of fossil fuel is being replaced by the age of electricity. And with that actually comes the age of mining, and perhaps the word mining is not so often mentioned when we talk about minerals. Mining is the industry obviously behind this extraction. So the rollout of renewable energy, infrastructure, clean energy technologies requires supplies of these minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, just to name a few. And it's very clear that the energy transition is driving such large demand for these minerals that more mining is going to be needed to meet these global needs, at least for now. Many countries are now scrambling to secure supplies of minerals, which also have applications not just in the energy transition, but also in modern computing and defense, which is obviously a very live conversation right now. But it's also clear that an unchecked acceleration mining cannot be the solution. The extraction and processing of minerals is often associated with environmental destruction, human rights abuses, pollution, and conflict around the world, with local communities often shouldering many of the costs and too few of the benefits. So we are now at serious risks of replicating the resource curse and extractivist policies of the past, in which we failed to distribute the benefits of extraction between producers and consumers. So, today we are seeing social conflict around mineral projects that can cause disruptions to supply chains. There's also a real risk of creating a backlash against some of these energy transition technologies. We've seen deforestation and environmental destruction in sensitive and biodiversity-rich areas around the world. And it's in everyone's interest to get this right, to ensure that responsible mining actually helps build a just and equitable energy transition. So this is what this event is going to try and tackle. And so just to leave you with some opening questions that we will be asking. So how do we rebuild trust in mineral supply chains and ensure extraction doesn't trample human rights or the environment? How do we ensure the costs and benefits of mining for the energy transition are shared equitably? And how do we make sure that millions of people in resource-rich developing countries benefit from this global rush for resources? So today we're really lucky to have, we'll start by hearing a presentation from Phil Bloomer, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre's Executive Director. Phil will help us set the scene and present some of the findings of BHRC's latest Transition Minerals Tracker, which monitors human rights policies and practices of companies mining commodities for the energy transition. Then we'll have a panel discussion for about 45 to 50 minutes. And I would like to introduce our panelists that are with us today. So just to my right here is Estelle Levan-Nelly, founder and CEO of Living Sources and the Commissioner for the Global Investor Commission on Mining. which is an investor-led initiative which seeks to define a vision for a socially and environmentally responsible mining sector by 2030, and also wants to define the role of finance in realizing that vision. And Estelle is also a member of the G7
Gender Equality Advisory Council.
Gender Equality Advisory Council. Thank you for the G7. Next to Estelle, we have Cecilia Mattea, who's Europe's lead for the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA. IRMA is a voluntary mining standard that is governed equally by the private sector, local communities, civil society, and workers, and it offers third-party assessments of mining sites around the world. Next to Cecilia, we have Andi Mutakian, the executive director of the Indonesian NGO Satya Bumi, which is an environmental and human rights campaign organization. And Satya Bumi has done a lot of work on the impact of nickel mining in Indonesia, and especially on the island of Cabena off the coast of Sulawesi, which maybe we'll hear more about, hopefully. And then next to Andy, we have Elisa Morgera, the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights. And then finally, joining us online from Argentina is Ignacio Coniz, who's a freelance journalist. And last year, Ignacio reported a fantastic story for Climate Home News on doctors in northern Chile raising the alarm about soaring cases of severe autism in children. And these doctors were basically pointing the finger at ongoing pollution from copper mining operations. It's a really interesting story on health impacts, and really recommend having a look at Climate Home News website for it if you haven't seen it. Now, I've done a lot of talking. I'll let Phil take on the stage and set the scene for us, Phil. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Chloe, and thanks to Climate Home News as well. I suppose, to start, there's no doubt that climate change represents for all of us the ultimate risk to our human rights. We have to respond with far greater urgencies, as Chloe said, through the rapid deployment of renewable energy and also through the general electrification of our energy systems. And that means basically a monumental overhaul of our global energy systems, and it means a massive mineral-intensive effort, tempered as that must be by also recycling and reuse of those minerals as they're pulled out of the ground. But the urgent need that there is now for these minerals cannot serve as an excuse for a new wave of extraction rooted in human rights abuse, in environmental destruction, and indeed in deepening inequalities. We have to, as the title originally said, break with the past, and that past that has squandered the trust in the transition so far. So the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre works with our partners and allies, including Andy here, and we seek to put human rights at the heart of business to deliver a just economy, climate justice, as well as end abuse. We've been tracking the impact of these transition minerals for over a decade. And we've just released our latest annual transition mineral tracker. It's a record of the publicly reported allegations of abuse for bauxite, cobalt, copper, iron ore, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc. And it's just the publicly reported. So indeed, it's the tip of an iceberg, as we know from all the cases that there are. And this slide is the briefest snapshot of our analysis of those grassroots allegations that we've received over the last decade and indeed in the last year in large-scale mining operations. And these allegations of abuse are prevalent, as you can see, around the world. The abuse is focused on local communities, on workers, on the environment. Of course, we have to note that indigenous peoples are 4 times more likely to be attacked. Now, that's partly because, obviously, over half of the world's known resources are found in the geologies of their territories for these transition minerals. But it's also partly through racism, because indigenous peoples are in those remote and marginalized areas, and they are deemed expendable by those in power in their search for profit. So the impact of those mining operations are, of course, many. as Chloe's just highlighted. Companies can choose to mitigate the harm, or they can basically externalize those costs and pass them on to workers and to communities. It's their choice as to which way they go. And a frequent pattern that, of course, we see, as you'll hear from the panel later, is that it starts with environmental violations of particularly water and soil pollution. That's compounded by limited or even indeed no consultation with local residents and with workers, and that then leads to protracted conflict. Now, just a few examples of this. For instance, in the Democratic Republic of Congo just recently, local residents protested against the Kinsever copper and cobalt mine, accused of suffocating the village due to air and water pollution and accusations of land grabbing. In Odisha, India, the public consultation for environmental clearance by the Sijimali bauxite mine took place in the context of strong rights holder opposition, but of course matched indeed by state-backed repression. And in Zimbabwe, unionized workers at the Bikita lithium mine were the targets of intimidation and threats, allegedly in response to their fight against harassments, long working hours, and corruption at the mine. Now, 1 in 5 of the allegations that we receive is against a human. 1 in 5 of the allegations and the attacks that we receive is against a human rights defender. Now, this includes killings, intimidation, threats, judicial harassment through slaps, the strategic litigation against public participation, committed by states in support of companies, mining companies, or indeed by private mining companies and their private security forces. But these attacks are calculated to silence the critics of irresponsible mining operations. And they're calculated to strike fear into the communities that these leaders represent. And our broader research, of course, on human rights defenders demonstrates year upon year upon year that indeed the mining sector is the most dangerous of all the business sectors for human rights defenders to operate in. So repressing dissent, instead of listening to the concerns of mining-affected communities, does not accelerate the energy transition. It squanders trust, and to the contrary, therefore, it risks fueling lasting conflicts. We have to understand that negotiations between mining conglomerates and the communities and workers occur in conditions of extreme inequality, inequality of power and inequality of wealth. Without action by the companies and the governments to make sure that we support communities' understanding, but also their voice in that negotiation, the negotiations always, almost always at least, simply entrench the inequality and poverty that already exists. So mining companies should not be surprised, of course, when those aggrieved communities and workers then take up the only tools, negotiating tools, that are effective in those conditions, which are protests, blockades, and a resort to the courts to delay the operations, leading, of course, to a slower transition. Just recently, for instance, in Bolivia, local courts suspended 2 lithium extraction deals worth more than $2 billion, following a legal challenge by the indigenous communities themselves based on environmental issues and a lack of consultation by the Russian and Chinese companies involved in those cases. Now, therefore, too much evidence tells us that change won't happen through simply depending on the goodwill and voluntary action of most of the mining companies. Instead, we need smart regulation and indeed smart business incentives to redirect capital towards sustainability and towards a respect for human rights. The evidence, of course, from better regulated jurisdictions like Canada and New Zealand shows us that bad companies change their practice for the better. They change their practice where they face massive legal risks and massive costs in terms of fines. But good companies also benefit from those same conditions. Good companies benefit from that regulatory level playing field which the regulation creates, and they're not then being undercut by polluting and abusive competitors. Of course, the better companies and investors are not waiting for that regulation. They recognize already the value of responsible action and responsible mining. So robust multi-stakeholder initiatives play a key role in this, if and when they have a high bar for the respect for human rights and environmental rights, like the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance that Cecilia will speak about later. But the contrary is also true. Weak industry standards, such as that of what is being prepared now in a draft consolidating mining standard initiative, they risk entrenching and indeed legitimising abuse in the mining sector. Now, investors too are taking action. They recognise that the business case and the moral case for human rights protection are converging. Recently, Norges Bank, for instance, has decided to engage through active ownership of Rio Tinto and South 32 regarding a joint venture that they're in bauxite mining in the Amazon rainforest, and that's specifically to reduce environmental damage. Now, our secure and prosperous futures, therefore, depend on a fast energy transition that is also fair. And in turn, that fast transition depends on the fairness for workers and communities on which the extraction of those minerals depend. So how can we make this happen? Well, from our experience, we reckon there are at least three key core principles. Shared prosperity has to be generated, responsible business conduct has to be insisted upon, and fair negotiations have to happen. So for shared prosperity, that's about the mining companies and their investors working upstream in the design of the operations and then in the execution downstream of those operations to generate broad benefit and support, perhaps through co-ownership models, through value-added approaches, to generate the buy-in from communities and workers that's going to be necessary, who will then share in that wealth that's generated from the transition minerals and the clean energy generation on their lands. Now, secondly, responsible business conduct. Companies and investors have a duty of care to demonstrate human rights and environmental due diligence in their operations. They should shield, therefore, the vulnerable workers and communities from harm and put them first for the energy transition in terms of decent work. Due diligence must be established in governmental regulations and incentives. And we're starting to see this emerging, slowly at least, but emerging, in places such as Brazil, Mexico, even Indonesia, where Andy comes from, South Africa, Kenya, Sierra Leone, and we pray, of course, that the European Directive on Due Diligence will be maintained over the coming years. And then thirdly, that issue of fair negotiation. Communities need to know that there will be respectful negotiations where there is a right to free and prior and informed consultation and consent, and that will be upheld through the project. Finally, just to say, rushing through to extract transition minerals without learning the lessons from the past and without addressing the inequality of power and wealth that exists in those businesses will not solve our climate crisis. To the contrary, it will slow down the transition and it will backfire upon us. There is a better way, and one that can contribute to the objectives of a just and rapid global energy transition. As the United Nations Secretary General's Critical Minerals Panel report said just at the end of last year, they underlined that human rights must be at the core of all mineral value chains. In this urgent transition, we need care and we need justice. Otherwise, public trust will be too quickly squandered and the transition will slow. So I want to leave you with just the wise words of some of our friends. Edson Krenak from Cultural Survival in Brazil, that the world needs to do better at truly listening to indigenous voices. And Annabelle Rosenberg from Climate Action Network, who said that we need a radically different approach, one that supports rather than hinders climate justice. Thanks very much for this. And if you want to know more, you can always use that QR code. And I wish, of course, the panel and Chloe a fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you so much, Phil, for setting the scene for us. I think that put things into great perspective for our conversation. So we've got now about 50 minutes for a panel discussion, and then I'll open it to questions from you, the audience. So if you've got any questions as we go along, make a note of it, and there'll be time at the end to answer some of your questions. But to start, I actually would like to start with Andy, if that's okay, to continue on what Phil was saying. So, Andy, you've been reporting, and your organization has been following the impacts of nickel mining in Indonesia, as I was mentioning in the introduction. Can you talk a little bit about what are the environmental and social implications of that currently in Indonesia? And when we think about breaking with the past, have we learned any lessons from past extractivist policies, specifically in the context of Indonesia?
Right. Sorry, I will be a bit slow. Yeah. So the impact of the environment and social, I will be speak on environmental, social, and also the health issues here. In Kabena, for the context for all of you, it's similar like Raja Ampat area that already campaign now. It's very popular. Kabena is a small island, so what the impact there under nickel mining now, the forest already degraded, deforestation already there, and water pollution, sea, and also the river already polluted and cannot be used anymore for daily use. That's the problem. And other impact is because the sea water already polluted, no one from Bajau community, this is the indigenous people original from Sulawesi, they catching the fish. They are sea nomad people in Indonesia. They cannot catching fish anymore. They currently depend on working in the mining site. It's very changing their culture. That's the problem. And another important for the problem is about health issues. We do the research in the laboratorium about the nickel mining, about the water, and urine from the community. This is very dangerous because, after we put in the laboratorium and the result is very dangerous, there are potential kidney damage, cardiovascular risk, and diabetes mellitus type 2. And another point is, after the doctor from Cambridge University analyzed this laboratorium result, they got the overall of the research. There is endemic cancer which is only exists in that area. This will be happen if the nickel mining didn't stop there. That's the problem. Another what I can learn here, because this is the Kabena is small island. It's very limited for the environmental capacity. It should not be mined anymore. Under the law, this is unprohibited to be mined in this small island. So what we need to do, we can see the consequences is very serious now. Since Indonesia doesn't have any strict requirement on environment and human rights, this will be never changing anymore in the future. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. And we should say, so nickel is being mined for to produce batteries for the EV supply chain, and Indonesia has actually been building up the supply chain. So Indonesia is actually an example where it's a producer country of mineral, but it's also been building up the value chain and going some way towards manufacturing batteries. But thank you so much for those reflections. Elisa, I would like to go to you next. So Elisa is the UN Special Rapporteur for Climate Change and Human Rights, and I think Phil, at the end of his remarks, mentioned this panel which the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres convened to look at critical energy transition minerals, and the panel's recommendations called to put human rights at the core of all mineral value chain. And this is interesting because there's also human right for a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And you have said yourself in the past, I believe, that minerals, extracting more minerals cannot be a silver bullet to solve the climate crisis. So my question is, how do we overcome what sometimes seems like this tension between the human rights of societies to ensure conditions for a safer climate, i.e. by accelerating the energy transition, but also the human rights of indigenous people and local communities that are negatively affected by mining? So how do we reconcile what appears like a tension between those different groups as human rights?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this question. I think it is crucial to understand the current debates and how sometimes they can make things even more difficult than they already are. We all have a human right to a healthy environment, which includes interlinked elements of a safe climate, clean air, fresh, safe water, non-toxic environments in which to live, work, and play, and healthy biodiversity. All of them are essential for human well-being. And unfortunately, there's often a portrayal in these discussions around critical minerals around what may appear as an opposition between protecting indigenous people's human rights and protecting wider society human rights in the context of climate change. And protecting their rights to also development, to an adequate standard of living. And unfortunately, that is a false dichotomy, and a very dangerous false dichotomy at that. Because if in our search for critical minerals we are violating human rights, that means that there's something misaligned in the underlying economic and business model that does harm to our life-supporting systems, and in fact harms the climate system itself. And this is because indigenous people's human rights are a reflection of indigenous people's worldviews and science, where they have a much deeper understanding of the intrinsic interdependence and interconnectedness between our human well-being in all its dimensions and a healthy environment from bacterial to planetary level. So it's essential to understand that whenever the search for critical minerals is negatively impacting on indigenous people's human rights, that is also negatively impacting on our shared environment, and why some of us may feel quite far away and quite safe from those negative impacts. That again is an appearance. We're all going to be sooner or later negatively impacted, whether we're losing biodiversity, whether we're harming fish and waters. And in the current of the complex planetary crisis we're in, we have no time to make any more wrong choices in proceeding towards protecting our safer climate.
Great, thank you for that. So, false dichotomy between, the human rights of ensuring that safer climate conditions and the human rights of communities. All these things actually are part of the same goal we should have, just to protect the environment, our planet, and everyone's human rights. So I think that's a great basis for the rest of the conversation. I'd like to bring it to Estelle for the role of investors and finance. I think Phil mentioned, we need smart regulation and smart business incentives to be able to really move the dial on this now. So can you tell us a bit about what role can and should investors play to ensure that mining companies actually respect people's human rights and respect the planet, and should they prioritize investing in companies that are following best practice now, or is there a role of investors to be able to shape and influence the sector from within?
Superb. Well, firstly, I want to thank Phil for his intervention before, because pretty much everything he said resonated very strongly with me. I think the first thing to say is that, and I've been learning this myself, I don't have an investment background. I'm a sustainability practitioner that's been working in minerals for 20 years. But thanks to the Global Investor Commission and our work with responsible investors at Levenshulst, I've learned a bit. Firstly, there's different categories of investors, and they have different roles in the mineral value chain. And so when you look at them as a homogeneous group, you don't actually target, you don't end up working in a targeted fashion, and then your advocacy is lost. So you really must understand that they have different roles to play. And you mentioned due diligence, Phil, which of course is the very first and obvious thing that they could be doing. And along the OECD 6-step framework for responsible business conduct, there's a role for investors in pretty much every step when they're doing due diligence on whether or not they should be investing in a mining company. And there are ways of investors doing that better. So not just understanding their exposure and influence, but really the key moment is at that point of contracting. When they can choose to, that's when they can use their leverage over pushing for higher human rights performance and environmental performance by the miner. But also once that contract is in place, monitoring and staying involved. So we did due diligence on a copper cobalt mine in DRC for a battery manufacturer, and their investor was right there in the room, really keeping on top, firstly, doing due diligence on us as the provider for due diligence, making sure that we were qualified, but then really challenging us and really working with us on the findings as a collaborator and partner to that battery manufacturer. And so taking that kind of partnering approach, I think, is key. Another thing an investor that we're working with is doing is they are building a mechanism for supporting access to remedy. So because they are dedicated to implementing the UNGPs, they have this mechanism that means that rights holders affected by their investments can come to them as well as through other pathways to access justice. I think another thing that investors can do is be proactive about investing in those solution providers that drive greater sustainability along minerals value chains. So this isn't just about, are you investing in a mining that's operational because perhaps you're an institutional investor that is investing in publicly listed companies. This is about venture capitalists and others that are there with all these solutions for traceability, data management, penetration of cleaner technologies, scaling new things. That stuff really struggles to get access to capital, and that's where there's a big gap, because sustainable finance goes, ooh, mining, yuck, dirty, not touching. And conventional finance goes, all this hippie stuff, not really interested. And there's a big funding gap there, and that's really holding mining back from becoming more sustainable. Advocacy, participating in standard setting. I know that IRMA and the RMI now have investor chapters or chambers within their governance bodies, which is really, really superb. And the type of collective action that is happening through the Global Investor Commission, where we have I think 82 investors with 17 trillion under assets, collaborating to set expectations that should address systemic risks to the environment and to people, but also to ultimately leave a positive legacy, which is a higher ambition level than most businesses seek to deliver when it comes to working in minerals value chains. And that's something I hope I can talk a bit about later. On the question of should they prioritize best practice, look, it really depends on your risk appetite. If you have a really, really low risk appetite, then you're going to have to stick with best practice. If you have a higher risk appetite, but you're not fit for the risk, you're going to have to stick with best practice. I want to see more investors. As a gender person, I don't want to say man up, forgive me, but I want to say man up. and go into the hard stuff and be part of the transformation, act as that enabling partner. Because we, as society, need them to do that. That's a big ask, because finance is very conservative and very risk averse. So who are those brave investors that are willing to step up and sit in those emerging markets within mineral sustainability to really drive the change? Yeah.
Great, that's a really good message if there are any investors in the room to man up and try and drive the change. No, That's great. Cecilia, I'd like to come to you, and perhaps you can also, really encourage you all to respond to what's been said before, and we can try and have a kind of more open conversation. But building on that conversation, so you're at IRMA, which is this standard, which, as I said, is governed. So what differentiates IRMA from other voluntary standards is that it is governed equally by the private sector, together with local communities, civil society, and trade union bodies, I think. So can you tell us a bit more about, in this space where we've got these companies up to, sometimes really damaging practices in very vulnerable contexts, and we've heard of the example in Indonesia here. At the same time, globally, there is a growing push for deregulation or simplification of rules for businesses, which is ongoing, at the EU level, also in the US. And on parallel to that, we've got a very fragmented standard landscape, right? We've got all these voluntary landscapes and voluntary standards, and there are many. So how can, are voluntary standards sufficient to ensure robust accountability of mineral supply chains? And how can standards help rebuild that trust in the mining sector, and to make sure that these companies can also play a positive role, following on from what Estelle was just saying?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to see so many people. I would say voluntary standards are not enough, right? Because what we need are actually strong laws and regulations. But unfortunately, as Andy presented, in many countries, that's not the case. And that's the simple reason why IRMA exists in the first place, is to try and address these gaps, because we believe in a world, as Elisa said, where the right to clean water should be the same, whether you're a community impacted by mining in Argentina, in Brazil, or in the Philippines. That's a basic human right. But when governments are not doing enough, or maybe the law is there, but they're not implementing it well, then there is a role for voluntary standards to help drive the change and showcase what's possible, and offer that almost a market slip for companies that want to go above and beyond, as Phil presented. There's a massive trust gap in the mining industry, as recognized also by the ICMM recently in a survey that they did last year.
So can you just remind us what the
ICMM is? The ICMM is the industry lobby association globally for the mining for mining companies. The reason why there's a trust gap is effectively because mining is a non-renewable resource, and once the resource has been dug up, that's it. That's basically it. So there's this conflict, this constant conflict, protests, right, blockades, because companies are not doing enough, and they're basically perpetuating the status quo. So IRMA becomes this space where not only it's equally governed, but it was built from day one with that equal governance, because it was an NGO called Earthworks. They were doing a campaign on dirty gold. They campaigned on Tiffany on Valentine's Day in New York City outside Tiffany's shop, saying that Tiffany was buying dirty gold. I mean, you can imagine Tiffany was not exactly thrilled, but the CEO of Tiffany, who was quite a visionary, he invited Earthworks to sit down at the table and asked them, where can I find a responsible mine? Tell me. Earthworks said it doesn't exist. 20 years later, we're still in that space where a responsible mine doesn't exist, because it's the harm, right, of that the industry creates. Now, the good news is that Earthworks and Tiffany sat together at the table and discussed, okay, what should a responsible mine look like? They realized that they could not come up with that definition without workers, communities, and of course the mining industry itself at the table. Later, investors came as well to that table, but it took them 10 years to create what is today the IRMA standard for responsible mining. You may be wondering why I'm sitting with like the stack of papers here. This is what an IRMA audit report looks like. It's averaging 200 pages of information that it's transparently accessible for anybody in the world to read, see, and understand why a given company at a mine site is only at 50% of best practice on biodiversity, or still has 30% to go on human rights, or only has 10% on transparency and revenue, for example. So how do we incentivize, and I think that's the big question, right? How do we incentivize transparency, and how do we explain that this is not a black and white world? It's very much a gray zone, just as due diligence is, because it's not about achieving that perfect outcome. Is how do you get there in the first place, and how do investors play a role, purchasing companies play a role, and everybody else that sits at the table as equals.
And can you just tell us how many companies have so far undergone a IRMA audit?
So there are over 100 mining companies engaged in the IRMA system right now, whether it is in self-assessment, which means when they are basically preparing for the independent audit, or that are already at the independent audit stage. What is unique is that 90%, 90, of mining companies that come to IRMA, they do so because their customers have asked them to. The customers are car companies, tech companies, jewelry, renewable energy. But those customers, in turn, they do so because they want to de-risk, they want stable and secure supply chains, but also because of the pressure that NGOs are putting. The tracker of the Business and Human Rights Research Center, it's awesome because it gives car makers the opportunity to look at, oh wow, I didn't know that about my nickel supply chain. I didn't know that we're digging, in an archipelago country to the sea. So how can we reduce harm? That's the first step.
Thank you. That's really interesting insight into IRMA, and hopefully we can get more into these detailed questions as to how do we incentivize transparency and benefit sharing in a minute. But before we do that, I just want to bring in Ignacio, who's joining us online from Argentina. Hi, Ignacio.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks so much for making it online. I wanted to bring Ignacio because, so as I mentioned earlier, Ignacio reported this story for Climate Home News earlier last year actually, around copper mining in northern Chile, and it actually was a story about health impacts of copper mining, which echoed with what Andy you were saying about the pollution in Indonesia. And we're talking here about all these big actors, companies, investors, civil societies, local communities. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a journalist of reporting on that story, and what were the kind of challenges that you found in being able to engage with all those actors along the chain?
Yeah, well, like Andy said, once you get to know large mining facilities, you expect some situations. I've done reporting on other mining facilities here in Argentina, not in Chile before. But when you see the numbers of Calama and you see that it's the world's largest copper hub, you know pretty much as a journalist what you're going to expect. And you're going to expect disease, you're going to expect pollution, and you're going to expect a lot of silencing going on between authorities and mining companies. And what I found in Calama is that situation, but probably worse, because Chile is a very dependent country of this critical mineral that is copper. In Chile, copper mining is called the Chile's salary. I don't know what percentage of Chile's GDP depends completely in copper mining. And there, the largest company is a state-owned company, it's Codelco. It's not the only company that operates. BHP also operates in the region, and other international large conglomerates also do. But the largest player is Codelco. Codelco is the largest player in the copper mining market worldwide. And being a state-owned company, and the regulators being the state also, and the institutions that have to do research and science around the issues that the people are denouncing and have been denouncing for decades, it's like they're on both sides of the counter. So it's a permanent silencing going on, a permanent greenwashing from local media and many times from international media also. And yeah, that's like the greatest challenge. The authorities don't want to talk about this. Little to none research is done, especially considering the problems that the people are denouncing, and the contamination and the pollution and the death toll is pretty evident. It's hard to not see it. You have to make a big effort not to see it. And that's the big effort that authorities and mining companies and et cetera, investors do constantly. They blindfold themselves to these problems.
It was particularly difficult on that story to be in touch with Codelco, wasn't it? And to be in touch with authorities. And as journalists, we were trying to, get to the other side of that story. And actually, what we were finding was a lot of closed doors, and it took a lot of pressure and the co-publication of the story in a Spanish Spanish language outlet, which would hit, a domestic audience in order for answers to become a bit more forthcoming, right? From both from the regional authority and from Codelco itself, which did respond.
Yeah, and when these answers come, they're always obvious, expected, and they always say the same thing. They deflect the problem. They deflect it to a geology problem, to something we have to research more. But it's always like the same jargon and hypocrisy, because it's pretty evident to everybody around them, including local authorities like the municipality of Calama, that we have a dangerous situation. It's dangerous for life, it's dangerous for the environment, and it's dangerous as a precedent of how large mining companies operate. Copper is a key mineral. There are dozens of copper projects all around the Andes Mountains, from Argentina, Chile, Peru, etc. And the Andes Mountains are the greatest regulators of our environment. This is where our rivers are born. This is where our water comes from. Our crops are dependent on this. So yeah, it's a pretty dangerous scenario. And we're talking about energy transition, but we don't see that in the global south.
Yeah.
We only see the problems.
Yeah, I should say that so Codelco did fully answer eventually our questions, and very much said that these health impacts that doctors were seeing, particularly soaring cases of really severe autism of children being born really not able to speak at all for years, was not due to their operations. And obviously you can read their full response in our story, and very much the local authority backed what the company said. But I think thanks so much for Ignacio for coming in on that. I think you had some strong words perhaps about how the company reacted, but it was very difficult as journalists. It was very difficult for us to engage properly with the company and investors. So as we're having this conversation, I think this is kind of an important point as we're talking about transparency as well, and accountability, that sometimes the media is very much locked out of struggling to properly get through to some of these actors. But I'd like to move on to the next round of questions, and maybe look a bit more about some of the solutions or some of the things that we can actually do concretely to try and move the dial. Andy, I'd like to come back to you. I basically, following on from that UNSG panel recommendations, of human rights need to be at the core of all mineral supply chains. What would it look like in Indonesia to put human rights at the center of nickel mining? Like, what would it look like in practice? And what do you think the Indonesian government and companies both operating in Indonesia but also buying from companies operating in Indonesia should do to make that a reality?
Okay, so this is very difficult to imagine first, because the mining already exists and polluting the water, sea. But absolutely we agree about human rights must be in the center of everything, processing, extracting, etc. What we can suggest is for Indonesian government, specific in Pulau Kabaina or Kabaina Island, must be stopped and revoke all the permit there. And then we can set up to another, move to another dimension. Indonesian government can evaluating the existing permit. That's the first. And then we can see how is the gap between the current practice of the mining company, and then how it should be in the future. That's the important. And another important thing for the mining company is they should practice responsible mining in the future based on the OECD guidelines, for example, or taking the IRMA standard. This is important since we know we have a gap between the Indonesian safeguard for environment and the international standard, like OECD guidelines or IRMA. And for the electric vehicle, what should be in the future? Transparency for the supply chain is very important. How the big automakers can disclose their sourcing from any island in Indonesia, any companies in Indonesia, this must be very important. So we can see, the consumers, NGOs can see clearly that these automakers not sourcing from the problem area or problem companies. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much about that point about transparency. Actually, I want to follow up with you, Cecilia, if that's okay, around the downstream, companies, because I think, Phil mentioned this, and Andy just mentioning this around transparency. IRMA members include buyers from these minerals, right? I think IRMA members include Ford, Mercedes-Benz, Tesla, but also Ørsted, which is the leading offshore wind company. So what role do these companies at the end of the supply chain have, to ensure that this extraction and refining can lead to a just energy transition? Like what should they be doing to ensure that further up the supply chain in Kabaina Island, for example, the responsible mining is being carried out?
So downstream buyers have, I already shared the stat around 90%, so you can see that they have a collective power, right? Because it's not Mercedes alone asking for something, but it's Mercedes together with 9 other car makers under IRMA's membership. It's Google, Cisco, Intel, Microsoft. It's not just Ørsted, but also SSE Renewables here in the UK that are saying, we're being asked to trace our supply chains, and I'm not really sure if that specific mine on Cabo is in our supply chain. But just in case, let us collectively send a letter to, last year they sent a letter to over 200 mining companies asking them to engage in IRMA. Some said, I'm interested, let's talk. Some said, no thank you. Some never replied. But Volkswagen doesn't know if that specific mining company is in their supply chain, but the collective effort, I think it's really key here. Andy mentioned transparency. I want to add traceability. I think that's an important element. So last year we released our chain of custody standard that sets basically rules around what are companies allowed to claim or not to claim, and then how do they trace from an IRMA mine all the way to the end user. We've got 7 pilots right now ongoing, but I can give the example of Ørsted. Ørsted knows that it's sourcing nickel, and it's been able to more or less trace that likely nickel is coming from Southeast Asia. It doesn't know, though, from which mine. But now, thanks to Ørsted's efforts, thanks to automakers, 30% of Indonesia's nickel is either already assessing or has committed to assess against the IRMA standard in Indonesia. That's progress in action. 40% of the world's lithium has been assessed against the IRMA standard. That sites in Chile, in Argentina, in Australia. Now, IRMA's theory of change is not to endorse or provide validation to companies that are already at best practice, but it's to bring increased transparency against best practice to companies that want to be more transparent. And that's really important, because I think if you look at, I think Ignacio said that perfectly, if you look on the news, you'll find bad press and NGO research about any mining company in the world, whether it is around resettlement, or it's around biodiversity, or it's around waste management. So all companies have bad practices. And that's what we're trying to change, that with the audit reports, it's no longer a he said, she said conflict between NGOs and communities and mining companies or purchasers, but it's this place where they can sit down and talk about improvements. And that's also what you'll find in the audit reports at the end. I'm hoping we change it and put it at the beginning of the audit reports, but it's what are the corrective actions that companies, these mining sites, should be taking? And then that's the engagement that due diligence laws ask for of buyers to work with their suppliers on changing practices.
Great, thank you, Cecilia. On traceability, that's really interesting. That these companies often don't know where their nickel or lithium is coming from, like which mine is coming from. I think that's a really interesting takeaway. I want to move the conversation a little bit around demand, if that's okay. And I know this is something that, Elisa, you've spoken about before, but I actually would like to put it to Estelle first, and then we can come back to you if that's okay. But so we're talking about how do we address and move the dial on these sustainability and social impacts. But at the same time, national security is dominating the global discourse when it comes to transition minerals. We don't have time to get into the geopolitics nitty-gritty of it right now, but are investors and companies in the industry, from your experience, actually questioning demand projections? And how do we ensure that this language of urgency, quick, we need to get a lot more lithium, demand is increasing by 8, 9, 10 times, more in the next, insert date here. How do we ensure that language isn't being used to justify unchecked mining?
Sure. So I think any good business person is always going to be checking the projections and sense checking them. Projections are exactly that. They're a forecast, and in an increasingly dynamic world that's in polycrisis, we can't take for granted that something that's published today based on research done 2 months ago is actually still completely valid and 100% reliable. So I think they are always going to be sense checking and looking at whether they would be more bullish or bearish relative to that particular projection for this reason or that reason. That's normal. I think we mustn't forget then in market nations' critical mineral strategies, the energy transition is only one of the driving factors that says that these minerals are critical to our economy. Digital transition, in particular the massive growth in AI that we are all experiencing. I'm doing a ChatGPT training right now, isn't that embarrassing? It is very real, and it's having a huge impact materially on energy demand, but also materially on minerals. So this isn't just about looking at energy transition projections, but also defense and AI too. So let's not forget that. Look, in terms of urgency, that urgency gets tempered when we do a couple of things. Firstly, we've got to talk more about demand. We've got to talk more about demand-side measures to change how we use materials. And we have to be working better to dematerialize our uses. So I'm just buying an e-bike right now. I can get a 500-watt one or a 400-watt one, but do you know what? I'm going to get the 400-watt one because it's 6 kilograms lighter, which means less materials. I might have to work a bit harder, but I'm dematerializing every mile that I'm driving or cycling with that bike. And that's just me as an individual consumer, but in how we design product systems and uses of products, we've got to do more on that. And Europe's doing a lot on that, and that's very cool and exciting. Another way to temper demand is obviously, as you were saying, Phil, not tempering demand, sorry, of managing this urgency is, really building supply chain resilience by delivering trust. And local communities, and we simply can't do that if we're screwing them over. And we're unfortunately continuing to screw them over. Even the best intended mining companies are screwing people over because they bring an extractivist mindset to it. They don't come in as partners to deploy the mineral endowment to the benefit of all parties that have a stake in this. They come in a capitalist system that compels them to seek to maximize profits for the shareholders because their corporate governance codes tell them that their directors have a fiduciary duty to do that. So where we can push for greater stakeholder capitalist models to drive our corporate governance code, where we can produce, dare I say, the potential for regenerative mining systems or social enterprise mining systems, then we might be in a situation where we can build greater trust and build more resilience. That might sound manic and crazy, but it's not. I'm working with a very cool new gold processor in Tanzania that is a social enterprise. They're proving that you can do this with that kind of model. The other thing that we can do to really make sure that the push for acceleration of production is better for people and planet is to really support environmental and human rights defenders. That's one of the key recommendations we've made in our work on critical for the Climate Works Foundation, where we looked at 11 countries. But in the critical minerals recommendations that I led for the G7's Gender Equality Advisory Council, that's informed what heads of states did when they came out with their latest their critical minerals statement a week ago. In there was a request, is clear that supporting environmental and human rights defenders is essential for maintaining transparency, ensuring the media can properly get involved and do their voice, and they're absolutely manifestly important. But I think that the last thing we have to do, and this is evident in Europe as well in the Global South based on the research we've done, is that regulators just don't have the capacity to actually manage permitting in a way that is efficient. And that you can actually streamline permitting, not necessarily by getting rid of or lowering the safeguards, but by actually investing in your regulatory system to understand the information that they've got better. If you've got a new graphite prospect in a European nation that's never dealt with graphite, they've got to build capacity and understanding on the risks of graphite before they figure out quite what conditions they want to put and attach to that permitting. So there's just some really practical expertise and systems things that we can do to expedite permitting that aren't necessarily about trading off people and nature. And we have to take very clear commercial lenses to permitting to find those efficiencies, rather than just assuming, get rid of the red tape, get rid of the red tape. It's not red tape, it's actually going to help you get things through faster. I've got more ideas, but I'll stop there. Sorry.
No, that's great. I think we can probably try and cover some of those as well in Q&A, hopefully. Sure. There'll be lots of interesting questions about this. But Elisa, do you mind, can you come in and perhaps build on what Estella said, maybe respond to that point about demand that I know you've made before. And also, the UN has repeatedly warned about this two-speed transition where we've got producer countries effectively losing out or being far behind in terms of the rollout of clean energy technologies. So all of these materials are being exported to consumer countries in Europe and America and others. But how do we ensure that that no one is being left behind, and that these mineral and extractions are building shared prosperity? The big question.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. And I think it is important. Sometimes we may think about relations among states as beyond the reach of international human rights law. We may think that international human rights law is about humans and their states. But in fact, more and more international human rights law has clarified that states have obligations to each other to make sure that they're not negatively impacting human rights in other countries. And climate change itself is very much a demonstration of how climate inaction, limitation in providing climate finance, they're all very clear and real violations of human rights in the countries who are least responsible for climate change and most affected by it. And those dynamics are at play now in the context of the search for critical minerals, and they are stacked against, I think, that continued unattended demand for meaningful and proportionate climate finance as well. But I think that there's even a deeper level of problem, and I will come to solutions as well in a minute, which is we can't just take at face value that our energy transition is effectively moving us towards a fully renewable-based economy. There are many ways in which even a transition based on renewables can still embed and lock certain countries into continued fossil fuel use. And that's where the questioning the demand is really important. What kind of uses are driving the demand for critical minerals? Are those uses that embed fossil fuel continued use and extraction? Are those models that continue to overexploit, to lead to more overproduction and overconsumptions, which will bring even more climate change? So we have to kind of question what may appear at the surface.
Can you give an example of that, of instances where it would, lock in the continued use?
So these are things that I'm learning as I go, I must say. I mean, my eyes are being opened as I learn more, particularly from environmental human rights defenders and communities who are affected. I've learned that in those sacrifice zones where we're still producing and burning fossil fuels, we now have new coal-fired power plants that are being used to recycle critical minerals from e-waste. I mean, we just can't have that. They're just inherently contradictory. I've also heard, and I'm still learning, that we're using more and more plastic in electric vehicles to make them lighter. But guess what? Plastics come from fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel industry is planning to expand fossil fuel production to produce more plastics. And we know that plastics is already affecting our planet, choking it, affecting the ability of our planet to regulate our climate. It's everywhere in our bodies and in our brains. So clearly we don't want that, and we don't want our search for renewable-based economy to fuel that. So what do we need? What do we need states to do? And this is based in human rights, and one of my favorite and less known human right, which is everyone's human right to science and to fairly and equitably benefit from scientific advancements. What we're understanding about renewables, about the role of critical minerals, we all need to benefit from it. And that means fair partnerships between countries in the global north and in the global south, including, for instance, through that co-development, co-leadership, co-management of value addition processes, of technology, co-development, the importance of local content, of truly creating the conditions for high-skilled jobs to be for the people and the experts, including community leaders and others in the countries where the critical minerals are sourced. And all of that is also to contribute to move away from that dependency, not expecting the technology to be coming only from the global north, because we know that for one thing, that technology will not necessarily be a good fit in very different contexts. And for another, it will not be built and be benefiting from indigenous science and local knowledge in different countries where critical minerals are. And it's not a coincidence that all these critical minerals are, for the main part, in indigenous lands. I mean, we really have to think about that as well. So it is important to see this as a process where states, investors, and financiers, they all think about what they need to change to create that basis and meaningful practices of co-development, co-ownership, and mutual learning. And that's where we all are able to see through where there are false or deeper problems in our transition that need to get our attention as well.
Fascinating. I'm just aware of time, and I would like to ask one question to Estelle, Cecilia, and Andy, quick fire, and then I'll get back to Ignacio and Elisa. But just on that point about benefit sharing and community ownership potentially, or these different models of ensuring local people benefit, what would be one thing? So, Andy, from a indigenous people, local community perspective, that you would ask to ensure that benefit sharing is not just a tick boxing exercise, but is actually enabling meaningful development. If there's a key demand from local communities to ensure that benefit sharing reaches those people on the ground, what would they be?
That's one of part choice for them, for the indigenous people. But mostly, I mean, we have a different culture there. Not all of them agree with the mining concession or benefit sharing. So this must be respectful by the government and also the companies. We can see more deeper with the different area. Is it possible to do with the benefit sharing or not? Some of them, yes, agree on that benefit sharing, development in the future. But other on that didn't agree with it.
So they need to be
Yes.
consulted and asked, basically. It
That's-
cannot be
that's
top
in
down.
the first step. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Cecilia, from the mining companies that you're working with, what would be one thing that you think is critical to ensure that that benefit sharing is meaningful and actually does lead to local development?
I mean, first and foremost, for Indigenous peoples, indeed, it starts with FPIC. So that's something that we put right front and center.
FPIC is free, prior, and informed consent.
Thank you. And for us, if you look at the chapter 2.3 on benefit sharing on the IRMA standard, what it explains is that it cannot just be economic, right? But it really needs to be built together and look at the lifespan of a mine before, during, and after.
Okay, great. So, through the life cycle of the mine. And Estelle, I know it's a massive question in like a couple of minutes, but from an investor point of view, what are the kind of key takeaways or key asks that should be embedded to ensure that benefit sharing is not just a tick boxing exercise?
Okay, this may not be with an investor hat on, but it's investor relevant. But I have 3 that I'll do in 2 minutes. First, meaningful stakeholder engagement. The OECD has a guidance for meaningful stakeholder engagement in the extractive sector. It is not implemented. And we, as the Global Investor Commission for Mining 2030, in the next week or 2, will be releasing our draft investor expectations for meaningful stakeholder engagement and benefit sharing. And so we really encourage everybody, please, to participate and review and put input into that, especially once the voices of civil society. Secondly, with my G7 hat on, gender equality. Women are just structurally prevented from equitable benefit sharing. They bear a disproportionate share of the harms, and in many jurisdictions, they don't share the same access or control over property rights or land rights. They don't share equal access to finance. I think 1% of joint venture capital goes to women-led businesses, even though there's compelling evidence that women-led businesses tend to outperform financially. So, we can't talk about equitable, benefit sharing if we're not putting women at the heart of that. And that's not women as victims, although that's an important piece because there are women that are victims of this. But it's women as agents of change and actors whose performance to deliver for the economy and for society is thwarted by structural discrimination. And so to that respect, I would say, please implement all of the recommendations of the GIAC's critical mineral recommendations that will be published in the next week or 2 that we've crafted here.
Great. Thanks. Sorry, I know these are really, really huge questions in just like a couple of minutes, but I'm aware of time and I want to take some questions from the audience as well. There's 2 things I would like to ask. Maybe I'll start with you, Ignacio. As we're thinking about these narratives around mineral extraction, and I think this has been mentioned, the coverage from the media is very often negative, and it's not very often that we actually hear positive examples of benefit sharing, positive examples of mining companies trying to get things right. Do you think that there is a need for more positive stories on this, and what role do you see the media play in this, and what also do journalists need from other actors in order to be able to tell these stories?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chloe. I'm not sure I agree with the positioning in the question. I think mining companies do receive a great amount of positive coverage around them. This is probably more seen in local and national media in the countries where these mining companies operate. And the not so positive or maybe negative coverage comes from international media. That's at least the way I see it, but not always. International media also many times covers like the positives or the great developments that these mining projects involve, no? It's a challenge because mining is absolutely necessary. It's necessary in these countries for economic development. Chile wouldn't be the country it is without copper mining, and Argentina and Peru, and a lot of the global south depends on natural resources extraction. That's the truth. That's how our economies are built. So you can't go against mining as an activity per se, but I think I'll go to something Cecilia said when she was giving the Tiffany example of how Irma was born, and they said the Tiffany CEO said, "Give me a sustainable mine," and there's nothing out there like that. So we have to build it, and we have to build it fast. And I'm not sure we're gonna do it. That's at least my view.
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you to all the panelists for your intervention. That's brilliant. We're going to take some questions from the audience now. One thing I would just like to throw in the mix as you're thinking about your questions is to ask Elisa about the recommendations from the UN Secretary General's panel, because we were expecting a follow-up to those recommendations, which I would really recommend you have a look at if you don't know about them already. We're still waiting. So I know that the UN is having financial constraints and is going through some discussions around reform. But can you maybe tell us a little bit about what's going on at that level, and also what is the role of the UN in ensuring that these recommendations can be actually implemented? So that's my question to Elisa, and we'll have some questions from the audience. At the back there, you've got your hand up. Maybe we'll take a couple of questions at a time and then put them back to the panel.
Hi, my name's Sagar. My interest in this has been for 10 years plus. And I find this conversation very interesting, Dede, especially when for the last 10 years I see my indigenous lands where there was forests going back to religious significance, when they're completely ripped out, soil is ripped out, 200 feet deep, soil ripped out, people displaced, women raped, children in supply chains, mining, not for fossil fuels, for every single mineral. But what I'm seeing here, what's so disturbing, what's so depressing, what's so sad, and what's so embarrassing is people are talking from the point of where the minerals are mined. Like we don't have forests going back 2,000 years in Africa or India. No. The people who are deciding what should happen in our forests should be Africans, should be Indians, should be Chinese. Stakeholder engagement. Why is it that this panel is not 110% African? We can't be talking about this issue, and in 2025, we're talking about the resources of the global south and how it's affecting those people in Congo and Niger, where those countries have decided to ceremoniously escort the French and the British at the airport to go, and we're saying this can be made sustainable. Just the question here is, it's very important. Firstly, these resources and forests is our right to be decided by Africans or Indians. Secondly, this just transition is not a just transition at all, it's a just regression. So I am really wondering, is this whole gambit to actually say how to do more sustainable, is it about really doing good for African India, or is it actually to hold a firmer, tighter grip on the privilege of the global north, of the activists who push these solutions saying, oh crap, what have we just pushed for the last 10 years? If we don't answer this, then I'm really happy to support Burkina Faso and actually make sure the British, French, and Americans are escorted at the door of the airports. Thank you.
Can you tell us where you're from? Sorry.
I'm from Holistic Economy. My roots are Indian and African, and I'm disgusted at these conversations today trying to justify the supply chains when it should only be decided by Africans and Indians. Thank you.
Okay, I will just add to that there are other places around the world where there are these minerals, and we've got some representation of that today.
60% is in Africa. Most of it in Congo. Thank you.
I think the Congo has around 70% of the cobalt and vast reserves of copper, but there are other places, for example, nickel, we have in Indonesia, and copper, for example, which is also in Africa, but also in Chile. I'll just caveat that. But yeah, we had another question at the front. Emily, I don't know if there's a mic going around. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Emily Stewart from Global Witness. I'd like to address the elephant in the supply chain. I notice we haven't really talked about China much, and there is no shared prosperity without addressing the fact that China is all over these supply chains, right? And I suppose this is probably primarily a question to Cecilia and Estelle. One, because I know IRMA has just completed its first audit of a Chinese mining company in Africa, and I'd like to hear a bit about the experience of getting them to the table. And Estelle, on investment, how do we kind of make the same measures that you're talking about towards investors when we're talking about big, mobilized public finance, potentially through the Belt and Road Initiative? Thank you.
Great. We'll take one more question. Anybody else wants to ask a question? Sorry, there's shy hands. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to ask to...
Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Diego. I'm a journalist from Argentina as well. I would like to ask you about the regulations that are needed in order to get a better energy transition. Focusing on the regulations, I was wondering how it's possible to get a responsible mining when the new permits are issued, and thinking in the countries of the Global South, for example, what happened, maybe Ignacio could add something more, but most of the measures are based on environmental impact assessments that at times they are surrounded by controversy, and then the potential effects of those mining activities in the future are not considered by then. So how it's possible to get an exact picture of the damage or the impact of those activities at that specific time when the new permits are issued?
Okay, great. So we've got 3 questions. So the first question, if I understood correctly, around this kind of, the risk of this neo-colonial approach of global north developed countries coming in and effectively grabbing the resources in developing countries, which is an extremely important point. Then we've got the role of China and engagement with China, particularly IRMA. And then finally, how do we ensure that the impact assessment is really taken into account from the point of commissioning the project? Does anybody want to start answering? Yeah, Estelle?
I'm happy to. Firstly, thank you to the gentleman who intervened at the beginning. I think the point of self-determination is of paramount importance. I was in Zambia last year, and language from the president was very much in the same vein, that these are our minerals and we are going to set the terms. And I think that in international trade agreements like the JETP partnerships that have been negotiated between market nations and producer nations in the Global South, we are seeing, particularly for those that hold significant resource endowments, a new kind of equalizing of politics in engagement between the fact that the North has the market and perhaps the capital to unlock the endowment, but the endowment does sit in that place. So there has been a shift in tone and in power, particularly in the context of those JETP negotiations. The second thing is I would want to point out that, whilst communities in the Global South tend to be more vulnerable to the adverse impacts that can come from mining, I'm working with a mining company at the moment that has a long history in part of the US, where indigenous peoples have been really badly affected by the history of mining there because their rights are so underserved in that jurisdiction. And so this is a global issue. There are important mineral endowments all over the world. Portugal is another example, and we're seeing local resistance there. Serbia as well, local resistance. So at the end of the day, I think it comes down to one of the points that I was trying to make about the importance of meaningful stakeholder engagement, ensuring full and fair participation in decision-making around what happens with people's land and with their minerals. And if people aren't empowered enough to do that, there has to be support to them to build their capacity to participate and lead, and where need be, resist. Which we are seeing, and that resistance is a very real thing that I know mining companies are thinking hard about. They recognize they need to change how they do it, but I know that there's thousands and thousands of mining companies, and many of them aren't that progressive. So I completely hear where you're coming from. I'm sorry that I'm not African, I'm Scottish, but I've worked in the industry for 20 years and I really care about people, and I've met many, many affected rights holders and worked to serve their interests in my work. So I still hope that my voice is still valid to a certain extent. On the point of China, Emily, thank you for your question. I think it applies not just to Belt and Road Initiative, but to development finance generally. And we actually, my team and I were having the conversation this morning that development finance institutions don't perceive themselves as business enterprises. And in their safeguarding policies, human rights aren't fully integrated. And they don't necessarily do human rights due diligence as standard in the form that we would expect aligned with the UNGPs. That's a massive gap, and that leaves the door open for continued harms through how they are seeking to control risk, which feeds into your point about EIAs, because that is in fact one of the most important points at which harms can be addressed. And when we led the authoring of the OECD's environmental due diligence guidance, we had quite a dedicated session on what can the downstream look for to judge that an EIA was of the quality that means that you know you can rely upon its findings. And you know, there's a whole body of experts that work to try and support ESIAs to be more effective as a gate, right? And you're right, it's failing in many jurisdictions. And it can be failing because the documents are, I mean, we're just part of an EIA on a dam, and it's 120 pages just on ASM, but they've got it for everything else. How do the regulators really get to work through that and make sense of it? So you're right, that piece isn't working, and it needs a very concerted attention from all of us, specifically on critical minerals, and specifically in jurisdictions that are low capacity.
Great, thanks so much, Estelle. I just want to ask Cecilia, because I'm just really aware of time, if you don't mind, we'll just run over by a couple of minutes as we started a little bit late. The role of China, and Irma has, is doing the first, accepting the first audit of this Chinese company. This Chinese company is putting itself up for an audit. Can you talk a little bit about engagement with Chinese actors?
Sure. So let me talk about the first audit in the DRC. It's an exciting moment, yes, because it's the first audit in the DRC, first cobalt, copper, and first Chinese company. So it's a pretty big deal. It's a mine that around this mine there are 400,000 people, 118 communities, and 17,000 workers. I've reached out to many of you in the room and online to please engage with the auditors early on with your amazing research, with your contacts from communities. My colleague Davidza is here. Davidza, if you can reach, she's our Africa lead. So, and would be happy to talk more about our work in the continent. And, you know, I think China, we cannot ignore it. I agree with what Emily just said. I'm always fascinated by how a couple of the mine sites that have engaged in Irma so far are majority owned by Chinese groups and are minority owned by one is a French mining company and another one is an American mining company. And I'm fascinated by how, those minority shareholders were able to convince the Chinese majority shareholder in different parts of the world. So this was, the DRC is 80% Chinese owned, 20% by the DRC government. But again, what I do want to stress is it's about bringing better practices and increased transparency and just bringing some sort of truth out there. And I think that's really important. And I want to tie it to the question on EIAs. I'll be very brief, sorry. One of the requirements in the IRMA standard is that if a community asks for it, a mining company must pay, in part or in full, for an independent water monitoring or air quality or waste, whatever it is. So yes, sometimes EIAs are flawed from the start. So how do you empower communities? And what is 5, 10K for a mining company for a community to hire a PhD student? And that's really the change that we're seeking to bring here.
Thank you. Yeah. Elisa, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
Yeah, maybe, first of all, I think that there's a lot that we can and must do while, the UN panel and follow-up process takes place. And that's a role for UN agencies, for international financial institutions, but also for state, for business, and I'll say researchers as well, linked to the question about EIA. And this is that those breaches of human rights that we're seeing in critical minerals, we've seen time and again in many other forms of extractive. It's not new. It's the same, unfortunately, textbook that we've seen in logging, we've seen in other extractive activities, and in many also neo-colonial processes. So at the very minimum, we all need to be fully aware and document even more everything that we know goes wrong. And that includes how we do tick box, all the way in which we do tick box consultations, all the way in which we don't provide sufficient and accessible information, all the way benefit sharing is misused to divide communities and to deprive them of their rights, and including questions of elite capture within communities and women being left behind in benefit sharing. We know all of that, but I think sharing the details of all the things that go wrong is essential to at least not repeat mistakes that are preventable. And the burden needs to be on us, not on the communities who've already in some cases experienced generations of the same kind of violations. I think the other point is that at the EIA, it's almost too late. It's not too late, but it's already where communities are in a very hard place, where a lot of assumptions, a lot of expectations are in place. And it's very difficult to open up a broader conversation about for whose benefit are we doing this? Is there a whole other way to do this? And to me, that means, first of all, that we need to embed all this understanding at the level of strategic environmental assessment of proposed plans, programs, policies, legislation. But even earlier on, we need to be more proactive and have the academic community, any other trustworthy, good faith partners, including civil society, working with indigenous peoples, working with other communities, and co-developing and supporting their own leadership so that they can already be an interlocutor much earlier on in the chain of decision making and set the frame, set the parameters for that conversation much differently.
Yeah, great. I think that was really for an answer. Andy, do you want final word? Do you want to address any of the points or no? Okay. Okay, well, sorry, we've run out of time. This is a huge topic, and there would be a lot more to say about the role of China. I think there's been lots of other events this week on critical minerals where this is being partly discussed, so I'll refer you back to those. But thank you so much to all our panelists. I think we've had a fantastic discussion today, and really touched on loads of different points, from transparency, traceability, environmental impact assessment, demand, the audits. So thank you to all our panelists. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us today and online. And we hope to stay in touch with you. And thanks for coming today.